I'd like to welcome you all to the Pavilion Pitfalls webinar. We hope you get a lot out of today. We work with a lot of companies, organizations that do pavilions. We also have been in the industry for quite some time, and so we've tended to see a lot of best practices and also some challenges, and hopefully you identify with some of both of what we'll talk about today, or at least some of what we're going to talk about today. We really want to make this impactful, so we did get many questions that came in before the webinar, and we'll certainly get to those, and would invite you to certainly ask additional questions. So we're going to go through a bit of content. I think probably roughly about 45 minutes worth, and aiming to save about 15 minutes at the end for questions. We're more than happy to take any conversations offline as well. So, let's remove the pressure from sort of needing to do everything in one call. Ideally, we'll answer a bunch of questions, but we'll certainly be glad to talk additionally. So, backing up from sort of pavilions and just sort of thinking about, the idea of building an economy and what you all are aiming to do, the pavilions kind of create two opportunities. One is this idea of recruiting companies into our regions, our states, our countries, our cities, and so on. And then they provide this other opportunity for economic development besides sort of the growth by adding companies, the idea of bringing companies from our region to a specific show, to an industry or to a region, to gain new customers and thereby increasing economic development in our region. So job growth and economic enrichment and sort of better economies come certainly from a variety of directions, and pavilions provide really two very interesting and productive avenues. And I think part of the challenge, at least that we've seen, is that complexity also creates sort of challenge. They're not sort of super simple, and how to get the most out of them takes a little bit of time and thought. So what we're talking about is something that may look like this. Obviously, there are a lot of configurations in pavilions, but the idea being that the host is exhibiting to bring companies to the region, and then there are sort of client companies that are exhibiting to sell their wares to whatever audiences locally at this event. So again, I would remind anyone that's come on recently, if you wouldn't mind just putting your phone on mute, that way we get continue to have really good sound quality, and towards the end we'll ask you to unmute for any questions or conversation. That would be wonderful. So here's our agenda. We'll talk a little bit about the pavilion purpose. What are some of the common challenges we see? What are solutions? And we should have some good meat on the bones here for some ideas for you. And then the idea of measuring results and continuous improvement or adjusting so that we continue to evolve our success. And then again, we'll get to your questions. So this is actually the questions that we've received from folks who were kind enough to share their questions. Again, we're not limited to these, but we'll certainly make sure to answer these, and then we'll double check with these at the end to make sure we did, and then certainly take any additional questions that you all have. So just so you know a little bit about me, my name is Bill Kenny, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Meet. And I have about 30 years in events, but I'm still very young. I just want you to know that. But I've been everything from an exhibitor to I've run many trade shows to now we work with companies. What our company Meet does is we focus on really two different customer types. One is working with growth companies, and often those growth companies are entering new markets, often new countries or new regions. And then the other is we work with economic development agencies, and ultimately our service is 100% focused on helping those two entity types increase their return on investment from trade shows. So we do everything from the strategy to the execution of trade shows. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really what we talk about every day internally, and we sort of live and breathe this with our clients. So again, glad you're along and can't wait to have some interaction about this topic. So let's hop into it. So we really aim to keep things pretty simple. When we look at the purpose of the pavilion, we sort of want to distill things down to a single objective in terms of what we're looking to do. And so we would actually, if instead of a pavilion, if it was an exhibit booth, we would do the same thing. So the goal that we see in exhibiting and in a pavilion is to identify quality prospects. Now that might be for the host organization, and it's likely also exactly the same for the client companies that are exhibiting within the pavilion. Where we tend to see confusion is where there's some tension where people think they can sell in their booth, and I should say our focus pretty much is 100% B2B, and certainly we understand that in a B2C environment there are some exhibit shows where there are transactions that actually can happen. In B2B shows, often companies are restricted from selling on the floor. In other words, transacting and exchanging money. So, but most don't know that. But that's actually in all the fine print of the contracts we all sign. It actually talks about that in there. And usually, unless you're really good and much better than we are, you're not going to get a contract signed at a trade show, because these are, generally first interactions with people, and there's little trust and knowledge and all those types of things that would cause a sort of meaningful transaction to happen. And so it's really a process. And so what we want to do, let's just say it's a large show. Maybe it's Hanover Messe, where there are hundreds of thousands of people. We know not everybody's a prospect, no matter what the show is, no matter what the event is. It's a small percentage of the audience or prospects for any company. So this is, it's a simple statement, but it's actually fairly hard to do, which is to separate the prospects from the general attendee. And at Hanover Messe, for any company, let's just say it's 1% of the audience. That's still a big number. It's a couple thousand people who are who you might want to identify at that show. It may be a fraction of 1%, but they're really, the process from here forward is about how do we, sort of in this sea of people, in this haystack, how do we find the needles? How do we find our prospects? And that's really what we're trying to do. So in doing this, if that's sort of our true north, what we're aiming towards, what we see is the common challenges are really twofold, and we're going to separate them out, sort of a kind of a core challenge from the host, and then a core challenge from the client exhibitor or the client company. So the pavilion host, what we see is the challenge to identify and enroll quality companies that are going to be good prospects for either opening an office in your region or moving to your region or country or state or so on. And so, again, sort of that notion of separating out and identifying those prospects from everybody else. And then we also hear that the pavilion hosts, and we see this quite often, where the pavilion hosts struggle to keep the exhibiting client companies so that they're fully leveraging the trade show opportunity. And there are so many places where where the wheels can come off, and you all probably know this just as much or more than we do in terms of the distractions that happen, the challenges in preparation, and not having a succinct value proposition, all sorts of different things, not having a sort of appropriate offer, all, again, the wheels can come off, and there's, the challenge of exhibiting is it's certainly live and in person, but it's fairly intangible. And so we have to make sure that we've thought through exactly what we want to do and sort of why we're doing it. And again, so it's anchored out at that objective that we want, which is to find our prospects in this particular event. And the challenge of these events is, the opportunity is really that the audience at any particular event is unique. In other words, this audience will never come together in this way again. And so they really are limited time opportunities. And it's really about, we actually talk a lot with our clients about exhibiting less better. And so we would definitely want, and where we find the best return coming from is much better execution less often. And that way you're sort of conserving your resources for sort of excellent execution, so that you're really taking advantage of that opportunity very well. So now that we've sort of talked about sort of two sort of core challenges, we're going to get into some solutions. And so what we're going to do is talk about three solutions that are directed at the pavilion hosts themselves, and then three solutions that the pavilion host would aim to facilitate potentially for their client companies that are exhibiting within the within the pavilion. Sometimes I get tongue-tied. So okay, so let's talk about these. So you've got a sort of a typical looking pavilion here, and so the first challenge that we hear a lot is around show selection. And in fact, this is where our service starts, is really sort of identifying sort of what shows, what the strategy and the sort of plan should look like. And ultimately it's that show selection. It's almost like the question around sort of in retail, how important is location? Well, as it turns out in retail, location, right? And so show selection, if sort of our objectives aren't aligned with the audience that we're going to be in front of, then it's going to be very hard to find relevant prospects, and which of course makes conversion that much more difficult. So, it might even be analogous to, sort of the age-old staffing question, sort of how do I hire good people? And it's really, or how do I have, productive people? And it's all about staffing, right? It's how do I find the right people first? We want to have a good foundation from which to build our house, and the show selection, where we're going to go, is really part and parcel to that. So let's talk about how we do that. So there are a couple of steps, and this is not a Ouija board based process, right? So we actually have a process that works really well. And the first is to sort of step back from worrying about where to exhibit, and first let's answer the question of who's relevant for us. And so we want to identify the target persona or personas that we are appealing to. So these are the people who, sort of think about the company or the type of company, but within that, think about the person who would make the decision to move to our region or to create a location in our region. We want to really narrow down to exactly who that persona is. So here's sort of a list of how we might begin mapping that, and this is somewhat situational. So these are just examples, and it really kind of depends on the specific client in terms of the types of attributes and questions we might ask to sort of tease this information out and develop a persona map. But the first, and actually kind of an interesting thing that we've seen is we found a lot more success in general in helping organizations recruit businesses to their region when we understand what the demands are in that region. In other words, one really good demand is to look at the enterprise companies in the region, and do they have supply chain gaps right now? Are there challenges that they have in fulfilling orders because of gaps in their supply chain? Or are there other demand-based indicators that we can look at from the large consumers in our region? And ultimately, when we want, it's all great to try to sort of attract people to our region, but nothing attracts them quicker and nothing invests them quicker than having customers who are ready to buy their products or services. And so we can have all the great amenities, we can have, sort of all the great incentives, but paying customers make the largest difference. So answering that question could help us very quickly figure out what industries we want to target, and then that very quickly begins the mapping process of what shows we would go to. So within that, of course, in developing the persona, hopefully we've answered sort of the target industry question. Then we look at the companies and sort of what are the key attributes of sort of the company and also the individual who would make the decision. So what products do they sell or services do they sell? What stage are they at? How big are they? Are there market dynamics that are happening? Maybe there's a depression or economic challenges in their country or region, and looking outside of that is attractive to them. There are all sorts of dynamics that can cause companies and these buying personas to be interested in a certain window of time. And ultimately, in order for an organization or a company to be a prospect, the sort of definition of a prospect is really simple. There are three attributes. They have to have a need. They need to have money or resources, more in this case. They need to have the resources. And they need to have urgency. And as we all know, if somebody is apathetic or overconfident, chances are they're not going to make a decision very quickly or maybe even ever. And so that urgency is a key part. So a very easy way to think of what makes up a prospect, just think of these three words: need, money, now. And if we can develop our persona with a sort of alignment to those three sort of criteria, then we're going to have a much stronger persona. And in fact, what we're going to do is line up all of our messaging, all of our marketing, all of our exhibiting towards identifying within the context of any show we're at, towards identifying and getting those personas, those individuals, to opt in. We want to, again, separate them from the crowd. So we've mapped our persona now. And then we're going to then look at sort of the array of events that would be possible and really narrow down to the ones that are centered around this persona. And sort of, if I don't fish a lot, I fish a little bit, but if you fish at all or you understand the idea, if somebody that goes fishing, when they decide, sort of what fish they want to catch, then they decide the place that's most likely to catch that fish. And so, you go to that sort of good spot where those fish are early in the morning or late in the afternoon or whatever the right timing is, and you catch the fish. And if you go there at the wrong time or you go to the wrong location, you shouldn't expect to catch the fish. And so this is really quite a bit the same. We want to line up this persona with the events that they're attending and maybe topic specific events that would get them sort of so that they're actually thinking about what we're doing or at least open to it. And then from there, obviously, we'll engage them. When we have this list of possible shows, then we're going to have criteria-based decisions. And so, the type of criteria is going to be sort of unique to the type of organization and the decisions being made. But ultimately, identifying those criteria, they may be weighted, and then we're just going to score them. But the whole point here is we want to remove emotion from this decision, and we want to be able to make decisions analytically, not only because we'll make a better decision this year. An event strategy really is partly about what are we doing this year, but it's much more about improving strategy, improving decision-making, and how we're executing over time. And so we should look for, just like all marketing, it should be evolutionary. We should look for continually improved results, continually improved decision-making, continually improved execution. And so if we can make more of our decision-making analytic, and you'll see we'll come back to this later when we get into the sort of metrics of all this and how do we sort of evolve and improve our efficiency, this information will become very valuable. So we want to be able to score. All important. So now let's talk about solution number 2. So this is, it's always interesting to see sort of organizations that do this. And if you do this, I apologize in advance, but this is wrong. Giving away an iPad or anything like this, a TV or whatever in your booth is absolutely wrong. And so the reason it is this is essentially, this is an offer. When you offer something in your booth, it will attract people who want that offer. So, let's just, that likely the people who want the iPad likely have nothing to do with sort of relocating a business to your region. And so you're not attracting people who have any relevance to you, other than if your metric is the number of contacts you make or the number of cards you collect, then Yahoo, you win. But my guess is that's not really what's going to create economic impact in your region. So this kind of disconnect is absolutely normal. Probably 75% of the booths we walk by may not be giving away iPads, but they have no relevant offer. And I would actually say it's probably closer to 90% of the booths we walk by have no relevant offer for the persona that booth is looking to attract. So we got to stop these type of offers. They do no good, and in fact, they're really distracting, because when you come home and you hand out the leads to whoever you need to for people to make follow-up, they're disenfranchised, right? They may end up making calls to people who aren't interested in moving to your region, and it doesn't work at all. So this doesn't work, and it's tragic for sure. So the easiest way to sort of figure out what to offer is to figure out what are your target persona's biggest concerns or challenges. So once we identify that, then we can have relevant offers that will help them. Oh, I just went the wrong way. So so we want to give them or create an offer in our booth. And I say an offer, one offer in our booth that only our prospect is interested in, only that sort of target persona for this particular event. And it should be something that is highly valuable for them, that gives them a pathway to solving this challenge or concern that they have. And so there are a lot of different sort of types of solutions, and we'll go through those in just a second. But the real goal, again, is to separate. The first sort of rule of this is all we're trying to do, we don't want to talk to sort of thousands of people or even hundreds of thousands of people. We want to talk to the 100 or 50 or 10 that are relevant for us. And the problem is they're not wearing a sign on them saying, talk to me, right? So we have to put a sign up, and we have to have communication that allows them to opt in. And so if you understand inbound marketing that's used on websites, this is the exact same methodology, just used for in-person events. So an offer, and then we get a response. And the people that come to our website that don't want the offer, we never hear from. That's perfect. And it may be that they're a prospect 2, 10, 20 years down the road. That's fine. We'll get them then. And they may be foresighted enough to stop by and opt in, but generally our offer is just going to attract the people who we actually should have conversations with. So the next idea here is, and why you want to do this in the booth. So again, if the booth is the intent is to generate and to identify prospects, sort of this other challenge within this section is that, people tend to put salespeople in the booth. And so sales conversations at a minimum are 15 minutes, minimum, and likely they're longer than that. Offer conversations, in other words, if we're offering, sort of a webinar or a white paper or a self-assessment or something like that, an offer conversation is less than 2 minutes and probably more like a minute, right? Is this something you're interested in, this topic or this webinar? And they say, oh yeah, wow, how do I sign up for that? Or how do I get that information? And so that kind of transactional conversation is much shorter. So again, all we're trying to do in the booth is to identify prospects. So let's do some more math. So let's just assume an 8-hour day. In the idea that we're doing sales conversations, if we're in the booth 8-hour day doing sales conversations, 15 minutes plus a piece, we can't have more than 32 a day, and that's if we don't take a lunch or restroom break or any of that stuff. So however, multiply the number of people in your booth on average by 32 as a top number. That's the maximum we're going to get. If we do offer conversations, we're going to have, could be upwards and maybe even more than 240 conversations in a day. So without even looking at the idea, the notion that it's going to be much more qualified and quality prospects that come from doing an offer, because these are people that have opted in for this topic specifically. This is something that is burning for them to solve, which indicates urgency. That is going to be a much more quality prospect and much more qualified for us. But as a minimum, even before we assess that, we're going to get 7.5 times more contacts than we will through this sort of sales conversation method. So it's a quality and quantity sort of equation here. We certainly want to always err towards quality, but we don't mind quantity either. More and better is always good. So really key here, and we can get so much more production out of these shows by having this kind of focus. So what happens after this? Then they go, once we've found them, then they go into a lead nurturing process. Again, we need to build a relationship. We need to build trust over time. We're not going to convert people at the show. It's not going to happen. So why pretend it? Let's have a logical process from here that handles and sort of cares for this lead, this potential new business in our region, and work them through that so that we increase the probability of their conversion. But it's really all about, from sort of the trade show and after, it's really about the steps to conversion. And it's not a 100% process, but it's really about how do we maximize that. And the first thing to do is get quality in the top end. So we get quality in the top end, and the rest works pretty well. So the third solution, and again, we're focused on the pavilion hosts, is around follow-up. We're looking at fruit. Fruit is perishable. It's just like the leads you get at a trade show. They will perish. They will die on the vine if we don't nurture and care for them fairly quickly. So it's kind of simple, right? We're going to make a phone call. We're going to send an email. We want to set a time to talk, to follow up, to learn about them, to engage them, find out what their challenges are, let them know, that the webinar is coming and they're signed up for it. All those types of things that we would do that would be relational and contextual for this particular prospect. So as we lead nurture, there are a lot of ways that you can lead nurture, but it's really first about offering content. So in some situations, offering sort of a webinar schedule or workshop schedule, offering white papers, success stories, maybe having a video tour, having them do maybe a self-assessment or even an interview type assessment. There are all sorts of different methods, and there's a much longer list than this, but the point really is, and it may be that there's a series of these, whether it's multiple webinars or you go from the webinar to the self-assessment to an interview, whatever. There could be a series of steps that sort of take people through sort of the normal onboarding and converting process. It may be, you may have a couple of different tracks depending on their interests, urgency, and so on. But it's really from here about sort of how do we manage that relationship to the point of conversion or a no. So now let's talk about sort of moving from the hat of we're exhibiting for ourselves within the pavilion to we're working with our client companies that are exhibiting within the pavilion, and we want them to maximize their return as well, because that impacts the jobs that are created locally and the economic stimulus that's created locally, and we obviously all want that. So let's talk about some solutions here. So in the individual exhibits, we might have conversations going on within the pavilion. The first solution, or the first key that we found, is making sure that the client, our client companies that are exhibiting, have skin in the game. And we often, as we talk to economic development folks, we often find that there is, sort of real interest in providing free or super low cost exhibiting booths to sort of get more people in, get more people out, in front of customers and so on. And that, I think there's a balance here. We certainly don't mean to be blind to the idea of getting more people out. On the other hand, people value what they pay for, and so often when we cheapen the entry fee, the results we get are watered down as well, because we tend to get folks that aren't quite yet ready or prepared, and that can be challenging. So we might look at a couple of ideas here. Number one is that they need to have some actual cash in the game in as an investment. We would also suggest that they agree to a minimum set of standards. So what might that include? It might include a number of representatives that they would have at the show. It may be that, when we look at shows, today we're talking about the pavilion and the exhibiting itself, but we look at that as only half of the people that are at the show, because the people in the booth are what we would position as engagement professionals, people who are good at these brief enrollment and engagement conversations where they're making an offer and getting interest in sort of enrolling people. The other type of individual that should be at the show certainly would be the sales and executive teams, and they should be in one-on-one appointments, working with people that are already in the pipeline and continuing to move them through, continuing to build that face-to-face relationship. They could also be attending workshops, networking. They could also be giving workshops, or all sorts of things, but that the executives and the sales folks should definitely be sort of out of the booth. They'll be much more productive there. And so we might have some minimum standards around the expectation of executive and sales presence and what they'll be doing. But again, the goal here is that how your pavilion executes is in large part driven by the client companies that are there. They have an incredible leverage over your results. And so making sure that, the sort of expectations are clear up front is really key. And then finally, having an agreement in terms of post-event reporting, and maybe having some, one way to do this is to have a entry fee that is 2x, for example, whatever x is, and then give 1x back when they've met the minimum standards for the event and also completed the post-event reporting. And so that way you can assure compliance, and everybody is clear up front, but the cost, you don't want to have to nag people. You can't afford to nag people. You want to have a good relationship. And so making sure, again, there's just skin in the game. Everything from your budgets to your success, to your upward mobility depends on the growth of your economy, and trade shows and trade fairs are an incredibly effective way to expand economies and really create economic exchange. So key stuff. So next is making sure that there's some sort of at least base level training for the group, and that really comes in the form of sort of orientation, sort of about this particular event and what they should be prepared for, what are the elements, what can they take advantage of, when should they start setting appointments prior to the event, all those sort of the roadmap of it, and then the actual in-booth people, what kind of training do they have? Here a picture of somebody on their cell phone. We've all seen that. You'll see there are no companies identified in this picture, so there's an anonymity here. The guilty will remain anonymous. But the point here is that we need to make sure, again, people are walking by your booth and they're seeing the 10 or 15 or more sort of exhibiting companies within it, and there's really good engagement. That's going to get them excited about moving to your region. It's going to say there's a lot of energy here. There's some cool companies, some cool people I want to meet with. And if they walk by and there are people on their cell phone, unengaged, uninspiring exhibits, all those kinds of things, it just communicates something you probably don't want to do. So there's sort of a double edge here, right? You got both, are these exhibitors within our pavilion, gaining good prospects here? And that's one. But two is, are they sending the right message to the people we're trying to attract, the businesses we're trying to attract to our region? So both are really, really important. So here's just a few example topics of how of things you might train for. So preparation elements, as I said, sort of the orientation and preparation. Then pre-setting appointments, the sales role in the overall trade show, the booth team and their training and so on. The idea of networking and making connections, and then maybe even competitive intelligence. Excuse me, I just hit a button by accident. But anyway, so yeah, competitive intelligence, and there are certainly many other topics, and happy to share additional ideas offline. So hang on here. So the last sort of idea here for the client companies that are exhibiting is exactly the same as it is for you, for the host, and that is follow-up, because this fruit is going to perish, and we need to make sure that we take advantage of these connections while the memory is current and while they're engaged and interested. So making sure we have good follow-up routines. And again, it's going to be, we're going to call or we're going to email, and it should be within a day or two or three at the most of the show's, the completion of the event. Some folks are so good at this, they actually do it while the show's going on. And some have strategies for sort of a mass email going out and then individual follow-up. And there are all sorts of techniques here. And ultimately, it's all sort of customizable to what works best and what's going to convert best, what's going to sort of make the biggest difference. I think more often than not, people like connecting with individuals. So the mass stuff may have less value other than just to get information out quickly. So we want to set a time to talk. This is really kind of what it's about. It might be a Skype call. It might be, a phone call, whatever sort of is key, or we may, they may come in for a visit, whatever, sort of fits that particular situation. But the goal is really to learn about them and their objectives and then see if our product or service is a fit. And again, thinking of it from the perspective of the client companies who are exhibiting within your pavilion. So with follow-up, another sort of key tool is to have some kind of a stickler system. Most of us on our phones or in our contact management system have ways to set reminders, but we want to be consistent. We want to, sort of, right after the show, maybe it's within 24 hours, we have the first sort of note or phone call that goes out, and then, maybe it's, if we haven't heard from them, maybe it's 3 or 4 days later, the next one goes out. But we should have consistency. We should have a way to manage it, because the less sort of random it is, the more predictable our results will be, and the more we'll learn from the process. But you really, all of that, all of those leads, all of those wonderful, urgent or reasonably urgent prospects that we identified, that their impression of us is going to be largely driven by how we follow up, what our professionalism is, what our timing is. And just because they don't return our call or our email in that first or second or third exchange doesn't mean they're not interested. And, I've often found that, sort of it takes sort of 5 for people to go, oh, geez, yeah, we really need to talk. Let's set a time to do that. And they just go, I've been buried, or, it's actually the timing's better now, or whatever the case might be. But we shouldn't take no response as a no. A no is a no. A no response is, it could be anything. And I guess I've failed when I've tried to guess. at whether someone's interested or not. I generally haven't failed at all when I ask, and they opted in for a reason. So let's follow up on that. So measuring results is going to be important for a couple of reasons. Number one is it allows us to sort of validate or invalidate what we're doing, but then it also gives us a basis from which to adjust what we're doing and potentially even not just adjust what we're doing in terms of our own habits, our own internal processes, but also what shows we go to, how we go to the shows we're going to, and even the sort of deal we have from particular shows. And we'll dive into that and talk about it for a few minutes here. So here are some examples of kind of normal sales metrics from these shows or show metrics. But how many leads did we get? And that might be, how many are potential customers, potential partners, and maybe potential channel members. There may be other sort of measurements that we would do. What was our cost per lead or per conversion? All of those kind of are key and really where the rubber meets the road. Again, this can be expanded. There could be other measures, but really just trying to deal with the ones that are sort of most direct in terms of sort of measuring the benefits or challenges of a show. And just because the numbers are bad doesn't necessarily mean that it's the wrong show. It could be our execution. There are a lot of variables that go into this. So we want to know, we want to have some data, and we want to be consistent show to show in the information we get. So besides the sort of hard metrics that we get internally, we also want to survey the stakeholders about the event. So the stakeholders may be our team that was in the booth. It may be also, maybe we could have had some partners in the booth as well, but or in the pavilion. And then it would be all of our pavilion client companies. They would need to respond to this. So what kind of quality contacts were at the show for each of these sort of stakeholders? Also, their numeric measures would be helpful. How did they feel traffic was relative to, sort of what their expectation was or normal, whatever normal might be. But really more some soft answers. What was the logistics like? Was it easy setup? Did we have a good location? Not just getting sort of yes or no responses, but also getting some more qualitative responses. And so the idea being here is that all this is going to roll up into an annual grid where each event can be graded, where we can actually understand each event's relevance to us. And it's not really fair to look at this once a year. We actually look at this information quarterly, and we're always looking out 12 to 18 months. So because if you just had an event in November and we just do this annually and we do it in December, well, we shouldn't expect the event in November to have produced at the same rate as an event that we did in February. It's just not fair. We haven't had enough time to work those leads and to actually see results. So we want to look at the production of our events, and this information really becomes valuable in a bunch of ways. Number one is we can certainly adjust what we do at each event based on this learning, and we should see sort of, it should be, again, evolutionary in terms of how each event produces. And we want to look for and develop continuous improvement in our execution. The really cool thing that actually, as we have this data and you look at, if you take, let's say you do 4 or 8 or 10 or whatever number of events, if you just take a line, you rank them all by their production and you take a line through the middle, and any organization, sort of the bottom 50%, any of the events that are in the bottom 50%, well, what we do is actually go back to the host organization and share this data with them, is to say, you're in the bottom half. We're not really sure if we're going to resubscribe. Here's why. We want to be really open. Here's what we heard from our constituents. Here are our results. How do we better advantage ourselves in your show? How do we better do this? And we may have the answers ourselves. There may be things we would edit or that we've evolved that we would change. On the other hand, we've seen organizers of shows improve our location. We've seen our rates go down. we've seen all sorts of sort of add-ins come into the deal that help us justify and in fact justify staying in the show, and in fact help us get a much better return and move that sort of event from the bottom half to the top half. And of course, every quarter that's going to be a new opportunities for conversation, because there's always going to be a bottom half, and so you can't help but to continually improve as you do this. So you're going to look to adjust your strategy, you're going to look to adjust your process, but you can also adjust. Again, there are other variables. Bring all the stakeholders, bring the host or the organizer of the trade show into the conversation. They're going to want to retain you. It's much less expensive to retain you in general than it is to find a new exhibitor, and they suffer. Most trade shows suffer from turnover, so they obviously want to reduce that. So let's get to your questions. I'm going to first, and we're right at quarter up, so our timing's pretty good here. I'm going to first just kind of go down the list of questions that were pre-submitted, and then certainly invite you to take your phone off mute and ask any additional questions. So here's the list we got in advance, and I'm just going to go down them in order. These are kind of random order, so I apologize for that, but let's see what they say here. So how do we engage client companies and help them succeed? So the context of this would be client companies that are exhibiting within our pavilion. I think we went through that pretty well, and let me know if we didn't or if there are additional questions there. But ultimately, first is let's make them accountable. Let's make sure that they're, that they have skin in the game, and then that they're accountable, and that they do good follow-up, and that they conform to a set of standards so that they're exhibiting effectively. So we want their execution to be as spot on as ours, not only because we want them to find prospects, but they're also an example of our region, and they're our best advertisement. People, when they come to our pavilion, want to see some examples of our region, and those client companies and how they execute are that example. Let's go to the next one. So how do we improve the quality of leads we produce from exhibiting? Yeah, we really talked about this right off the top, and that's first and foremost with identifying that buyer persona. Who is going to be the persona? What types of companies and what individual within the companies will be the ones that we'll need to appeal to. And once we've identified that, then really the show selection and our messaging and our process to engage them and to enroll them or to bring them in through this sort of in-person inbound marketing methodology works much better. And so, but the first thing is let's sort of step away from worrying about what show and how to first focusing on who. And once we figure out who, the rest pretty much lines up to that. And the who question is most important. And the narrower we can define who, the better we'll do. So is there a system for good follow-up? Really, the one that I found that works for me and that we use with a lot of our clients is this sort of notion of a tickler system of some kind. And, sort of in the old days, that was just a piece of paper that went, with our contact that went into maybe a 30-day file system where we kind of moved it 3 days. Every day we didn't get a hold of somebody, and that way, 3 days later we called them again. Now we can do this all electronically. Every contact management system has reminders, and there are even task systems that have a reminder component in them. So very easy to have electronic reminders, and that's really part and parcel to it. And then I think after that, it's just having the will to do the follow-up. And actually, here's after the reminder, I'd say the most important thing is scheduling your follow-up to be first thing in the day. It's almost like exercise. Is if for most of us, if it's not scheduled first in the day, it never happens. And if we do it first in the day, the rest of our day is fun because a lot of us don't enjoy follow-up. So it has to be a discipline in order to be successful. How do you pick the right trade shows? We certainly talked a fair amount about that. And again, happy to take additional conversation offline, but start with the buyer persona, start with that person who we want to get in front of, and then really line up the rest of the decision to that. Do you have any tips on how to get a better deal from the event organizers? Yeah, certainly I think negotiating up front is good and will work, some percentage of the time, probably a fairly small percent because everybody asks them for a deal. So you have to be, you have to have something special. Pardon me, I apologize. But where the best deals come from are with experience. And so if you've done the show once or twice, being able to share your results with them, and if that particular show is not performing well for you, being open and upfront with them about the performance, and asking for their help, telling them you want to do the show again. You see that potentially the right audience is there, and it's just not economically making sense, right? The cost of the show isn't finding enough prospects comparatively with all the other shows that you're doing. It takes all the emotion out of it. This is a very analytic discussion, and all we want to do, we want to be here, but it has to be more productive. Help us get there, and it's either how do you help us meet more people that are within this box and this level of quality, or how do you reduce our cost of meeting the people we're now meeting, or a combination of the two? Kind of simple math. Let's see, second to last question here. How do I get our exhibiting client companies to fully invest in the opportunity? I think similar to the above question is making sure there's skin in the game and making sure that they're invested in the process. And, we usually get what we pay for, and we usually sort of commit to what we pay for. And I think client companies, and we can pay in a lot of ways, right? I think money is one, but also our sort of other commitments to do something sort of qualify us as being interested and committed. And I think that's really the first thing, is do that test up front to make sure that they're fully committed to being there. And if they're marginally committed, not only are they going to take somebody else's seat, take somebody else's opportunity, which is a travesty, but they're also not going to represent your region well, which could really impact how you're converting other companies. And then how do we select the best floor location? Yeah, floor location is important. And I think it really depends on the features of the particular show. And, it's sort of, are there features that your persona will be particularly attracted to? So finding those sort of anchors where you're the people that, the subset of the show that you're looking to talk to, are there particular features or attractions that they're going to be, spending time at? Being embedded in that is ideal. Being just outside of it, or sort of, surrounding it, is sort of another opportunity. And certainly being far away reduces the value. Being far away from those sort of anchor places reduces the value to you. And so, again, that's another really good conversation with the organizers of trade shows, is to say, here's who we want. Your floor plan right now doesn't have a space near our, sort of the anchor places our persona is going to be. How do we, that's going to be an expensive spot relative to what we feel the traffic of our buyers will be. Is there a way that we can enhance this in some way so that, we don't come to you afterwards pissed, I shouldn't say pissed off, upset. We should come to you afterwards and say, how do we renew again? And let's set ourselves up for success here, and let's find a way to do that. And so I think having, again, the more clear you are on who you want to meet and where they're going to be. Excuse me, have a sip of water here. Excuse me. The easier that is. And so that's really where we want to get to, is that we can have these clear and analytic conversations with the different organizers of these events. Sorry, having another drink of water. So this kind of brings us full circle back to, we've got these wonderful assets, these pavilions that really are, the challenge of them is that they're only available, they only produce for us in a very finite amount of time. And so it's really, how do we come into that? The sort of probably about 90% of the success in executing a pavilion happens before you get to the trade show. And so it's really about how do we set ourselves up so that that moment is just highly leveraged. And, in a lot of these events, people have come from all over the world to be here. And so, again, they may or may not come the next time this happens. So it'll be a totally different group or a largely different group the next time we see them. Even if they're there, they may not walk by our booth or may be looking across the aisle or whatever. And so we need to execute each one of these well. And again, the idea being if we execute sort of less better, then we're probably going to have a much better formula. And if we do these well, we're not only going to attract better companies to our region, but we're also going to help the companies within our region grow faster. And all of that really creates significant economic opportunity and economic growth and stimulus and so on. And much better than any other incentive we could create is that situation where jobs are created and people's economic independence increases. And that's really what we're all about and what we aim to do with you. So that's what I have to talk about. Please feel free to take your phone off mute and ask questions, share your thoughts or experience. I'd certainly be happy to do that. And I'll just be quiet here and have a sip of water. And please feel free to ask away or make a comment. If you're talking, just so you know, your phone's on mute. So feel free to unmute and ask a question. Well, I'm going to take that as a sign that there are no questions and I did such an incredible job that you're all just now writing copious notes and making your plan to evolve your pavilion. I would really love having a conversation with all of you who are on the call today, and certainly would love to learn more about your experiences in hosting pavilions and your biggest challenges and what helped today. Any of that feedback would be great. What didn't help, what maybe you've evolved beyond or whatnot, that's all good. But please know we're going to do some follow-up and certainly would appreciate your response and learning more about what you all are doing and what your hopes are for 2018 and so on. But it's been a real joy to be with you today, and I'm certainly not going to prolong this if there are no questions. And I'll look forward to chatting with you each individually, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.